Hello, MAB Elementary. It's Mr. T here, continuing our literature group's reading of A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. It's appropriate for the season, and I wanted to make sure you guys could have the finish of the book before Christmas actually arrives in 2020. So we'll continue. The ghost of Christmas present rose. "Spirit," said Scrooge submissively, "conduct me where you will. I went forth last night on compulsion, and I learned a lesson which is working now. Tonight, if you have aught to teach me, let me profit from it." "Touch my robe." Scrooge did as he was told, held it fast. Holly, mistletoe, red berries, ivy, turkey, geese, game, poultry, brawn, meat pies, sausages, oysters, pies, puddings, fruit, and punch all vanished instantly from the room. So did the room, the fire, the ruddy glow, the hour of the night, and they stood in the city streets on Christmas morning, where, for the weather was severe, the people made a rough but brisk and not unpleasant kind of music, in scraping the snow from the pavement in front of their dwellings and from the tops of their houses, whence it was mad delight to the boys to see it come plummeting down into the roads below and splintering into artificial little snowstorms. Now, I'll remind you guys, literature group, Mr. T is reading this in the Victorian English style that Dickens wrote in 1843 when he wrote this classic. So it takes a little bit of effort, and every once in a while I have to repronounce some of the sentences that are written in this Old English style. So bear with me. I hope you enjoy it. The house front looked black enough, and the windows blacker, contrasting with the smooth white sheet of snow upon the roofs, with the dirtier snow upon the ground, which last deposit had been plowed up in deep furrows by the heavy wheels of the carts, wagons, furrows that crossed and recrossed each other hundreds of times, where the great streets branched off and made intricate channels, hard to trace, in the thick yellow mud and icy water. So Dickens is really special in his ability to describe scenes in Victorian London, and that was a good one. The sky was gloomy. The shortest streets were choked up with a dingy mist, half thawed, half frozen, whose heavier particles descended in a shower of sooty atoms, as if all the chimneys in Great Britain had, by one consent, caught fire and were blazing away to their dear heart's content. There was nothing very cheerful in the climate or the town, and yet there was an air of cheerfulness abroad, that the clear summer air and brightest summer sun might have endeavored to infuse in vain. London was a very sooty, dirty town because everything was coal-fired and there was smoke everywhere. For the people who were shoveling away on the housetops were jovial and full of glee, calling out to one another from the parapets, and now and then exchanging a fastidious snowball, better-natured missile by far than many a worldly jest, laughing heartily if it went right, and not less heartily if it went wrong. The poulterers' shops were still half open, and the fruiterers were radiant in their glory. There were great round, pot-bellied baskets of chestnuts, shaped like the waistcoats of jolly old gentlemen, loiling in the doors and tumbling out into the street in their apoplectic opulence. There were ruddy, brown-faced, broad-girthed Spanish onions, shining in the fatness of their growth like Spanish friars, and winking from their shelves in the wanton slyness at the girls as they went by, and glanced demurringly at the hung-up mistletoe. There were pears and apples, clustered high in blooming pyramids. There were bunches of grapes, made in shopkeepers' benevolence to dangle from conspicuous hooks, that people's mouths might water gratis as they passed. There were piles of filberts, mossy and brown, recalling in their fragrance ancient walks among the woods, and pleasant shufflings ankle deep through the wintered leaves. There were Norfolk biffins, squab and smarthy, setting off the yellow of the oranges and the lemons, and in the great compactness of their juicy persons, urgently entreating and beseeching to be carried home in a paper bags and eaten after dinner. Boy, that Dickens can write a sentence, can he? The very gold and silver fish set forth among their choice fruits in a bowl, though members of a dull and stagnant blooded race appeared to know that there was something going on, and to a fish went gasping round and round their little world in slow and passionless excitement. The grocers, oh, the grocers, nearly closed, with perhaps 2 shutters down or 1, but through those gaps such glimpses could be seen. It was not alone that the scales descending on the counter made a merry sound, or that the twine and roller parted company so briskly, or that the canisters were rattled up and down like juggling tricks, or even that the blended scents of tea and coffee, so grateful to the nose, or even the raisins were so plentiful and rare, the almonds so extremely white, the sticks of cinnamon so long and straight, the other spices so delicious, the candied fruits so caked and spotted with molten sugar, as to make the coldest looker-ons feel faint and subsequent bilious. Nor was it that the figs were moist and pulpy, or the French plums blushed in the modest tartness from their highly decorated boxes, or that everything was good to eat and in its Christmas dress. But the customers were all so hurried and so eager in the hopeful promise of the day that they tumbled up against each other at the door, clashing with their wicker baskets widely, and left their purchases upon the counter, and came running back to fetch them, and committed hundreds of like mistakes, all in the best humor possible, while the grocer and his people were so frank and fresh that the polished hearts with which they had fastened their aprons behind might have been their own, worn outside for general inspection and for Christmas dawns to peck at as they chose. But soon the steeps called good people all to church and chapel, and away they came, flocking through the streets in their best clothes with their gayest faces. And at the same time there emerged from scores of by-streets, lanes, and nameless turnings, innumerable people carrying their dinners to the bakers' shops. And the sight of these poor revelers appeared to interest the spirit very much, for he stood with Scrooge beside in a baker's doorway, and taking off the covers of their bearers as their bearers passed, sprinkled incense on their dinners from his torch. It was a very uncommon kind of torch, for once or twice, when there were angry words between some dinner carriers who had jostled each other, he shed a few drops of water on them from it, and their good humor was restored directly. For, they said, it was a shame to quarrel upon Christmas Day, and so it was. God love it, so it was. In time, the bells ceased and the bakers were shut up, and yet there was a genial shadowing forth of all these diners and the progress of their cooking in the thawed blotch of wet above each baker's oven, where the pavement smoked as if the stones were cooking too. Is there a peculiar flavor in what you sprinkle from your torch? Asked Scrooge. There is, my own. Would it apply to any kind of dinner on this day? Asked Scrooge. To any kindly given to the poor one most. Why to the poor one most? Asked Scrooge. Because it needs it most. Spirit, said Scrooge, after a moment's thought, I wonder you, of all the beings in the many worlds about us, should desire to cramp these people's opportunities of innocent enjoyment. I? Cried the Spirit. You would deprive them of their means of dining every seventh day, often the only day on which they can be said to dine at all, said Scrooge. Wouldn't you? I? Cried the Spirit. You seek to close these places on the seventh day, said Scrooge, and it comes to the same thing. I seek, exclaimed the spirit. Forgive me if I'm wrong. It has been done in your name, or at least in that of your family, said Scrooge. There are some upon this earth of yours, returned the spirit, who lay claim to know us, and who do their deeds of passion, pride, ill will, hatred, envy, bigotry, and selfishness in our name, who are as strange to us and all our kith and kin as if they never lived. Remember that, and charge their doings on themselves and not on us, the spirits. Scrooge promised he would and went on. And they went on invisibly as they had been before into the suburbs of the town. It was a remarkable quality of the ghost, which Scrooge had observed at the baker's, that notwithstanding his gigantic size, he could accommodate himself to any place with ease, and that he stood beneath a low roof quite as gracefully and like a supernatural creature as if it was possible that he could have done in any lofty hall. And perhaps it was the pleasure of the good spirit that in showing off this power of his, or else it was his own kind, generous, hearty nature, and his sympathy with all poor men that led him straight to Scrooge's clerk. For there he went, and took Scrooge with him, holding to his robe, and on the threshold of the door the spirit smiled, and stopped to bless Bob Cratchit's dwelling with the sprinkling of his torch. Think of that. Bob had but 15 bob a week himself. He pocketed on Saturday but 15 copies of his Christian name, and yet the ghost of Christmas present blessed his 4-room house. Then uprose Mrs. Cratchit, Cratchit's wife, dressed out but poorly in a twice-turned gown, but brave in ribbons, which are cheap and made a goodly show for 6 pence. And she laid the cloth, assisted by Belinda Cratchit, second of her daughters, also brave in ribbons, while Master Peter Cratchit plunged a fork into a saucepan of potatoes, and getting the corners of his monstrous shirt collar, Bob's private property, conferred upon his son and heir in honor of this day, into his mouth, rejoiced to himself so gallantly attired, and yearned to show his linen in the fashionable parks. And now 2 smaller Cratchits, boy and girl, came tearing in, screaming that outside the baker's they had smelt the goose, and known it for their own, and basking in luxurious thoughts of sage and onion, these young Cratchits danced about the table, and exalted Master Peter Cratchit to the skies, while he, not proud although his collars nearly choked him, blew the fire until the slow potatoes bubbling up knocked loudly at the saucepan lid to be let out and peeled. "What has ever got your precious father then," said Mrs. Cratchit, "and your brother, Tiny Tim, and Martha warn't as late as last Christmas Day by half an hour?" "Here's Martha, mother," said a girl, appearing as she spoke. "Here's Martha, mother," cried the 2 young Cratchits. "Hooray! There's such a goose, Martha." "Why, bless your heart alive, my dear, how late you are." And Mrs. Cratchit kissed her a dozen times, and taking off her shawl and bonnet for her with officious zeal. We're a deal of work to finish up last night," replied the girl, "and had to clear away this morning, mother." "Well, never mind, so long as you have come," and said Mrs. Cratchit. "Sit ye down before the fire, my dear, and have a warm. Lord bless ye." No, there's father coming," cried the young Cratchits, who were everywhere at once. "Hide, Martha, hide." So Martha hid herself, and in came little Bob, the father, with at least 3 feet of comforter, exclusive of the fringe, hanging down before him, and his threadbare clothes darned up and brushed to look seasonable, and Tiny Tim upon his shoulder. Alas, for Tiny Tim, he bore a little crutch and had his limbs supported by an iron frame. "Why, where's our Martha?" cried Bob Cratchit, looking around. "Not coming," said Miss Cratchit. Not coming, said Bob with a sudden declension in his high spirits, for he had been Tim's bloody horse all the way from church and had come home rampant. Not coming home Christmas Day? Martha didn't like to see him disappointed, if it was only in a joke. So she came out prematurely from behind the closet door and ran into his arms while the two young Cratchits hustled Tiny Tim and bore him off into the wash house, that he might hear the pudding singing in the copper. And how did little Tim behave? Asked Miss Cratchit, when she had rallied Bob on his credulity, and Bob had hugged his daughter to his heart's content. As good as gold, said Bob, and better. Somehow he gets thoughtful sitting by himself so much, and thinks the strangest things you ever heard. He told me coming home that he hoped that people saw him in church because he was a cripple, and it might be pleasant to them to remember upon Christmas Day who made the lame beggars walk and the blind men see. Bob's voice was tremulous when he told them this, and trembled more when he said that Tiny Tim was growing strong and hearty. His active little crutch was heard upon the floor, and back came Tiny Tim before another word was spoken, escorted by his brother and sister to his stool before the fire. And while Bob, turning up his cuffs as if, poor fellow, they were capable of being made more scrabby, compounded some hot mixture in a jug with gin and lemons and stirred it round and round and put it on the hob to simmer. Master Peter and the two ubiquitous young Cratchits went to fetch the ghosts, with which they soon returned in high possession. Such a bustle ensued that you might have thought a goose was the rarest of all birds, a feathered phenomenon, to which a black swan was a matter of course. And in truth, it was something very like it in that house. Mrs. Cratchit made the gravy, ready beforehand in a little saucepan, hissing hot. Master Peter mashed the potatoes with incredible vigor. Miss Belinda sweetened up the applesauce. Martha dusted the hot plates. Bob took Tiny Tim beside him in a tiny corner at the table. And the two young Cratchits set chairs for everybody, not forgetting themselves, and mounting guard upon their posts, crammed spoons into their mouth, lest they should shriek for goose before their turn came to be helped. At last the dishes were set upon, and the grace was said. It was succeeded by a breathless pause, as Miss Cratchit, looking slowly all along the carving knife, prepared to plunge it into the breast. But when she did, and when the long-expected gush of stuffing issued forth, one murmur of delight arose all around the board, and even Tiny Tim, excited by the two young Cratchits, beat on the table with the hands of his knife and feebly cried, "Hurrah!" There never was such a goose, Bob said. He didn't believe there ever was such a goose cooked. Its tenderness and flavor, size and cheapness were the themes of universal admiration. Eked out by the applesauce and mashed potatoes, it was a sufficient dinner for the whole family. Indeed, as Mrs. Cratchit said with great delight, surveying one small atom of a bone upon the dish, they hadn't ate it all at last. Yet everyone had had enough, and the youngest Cratchits in particular were steeped in sage and onion to the eyebrows. But now, the plates being changed by Miss Belinda, Mrs. Cratchit left the room alone, too nervous to bear witness, to take the pudding up and bring it in. Suppose it should not be done enough. Suppose it should break in turning out. Suppose somebody should have got over the wall of the backyard and stolen it while they were merry with the goose, a supposition at which the two young Cratchits became livid. All sorts of horrors were supposed. Hallo! A great deal of steam. The pudding was out of the copper. It smelled like a washing day. That was the cloth. It smelled like an eating house, and the pastry cooks next door to each other, with the laundresses next door to that. That was the pudding. In half a minute, Mrs. Cratchit entered, flushed, but smiling proudly with the pudding, like a speckled cannonball so hard and firm, blazing in half a quartern of ignited brandy, and bedlight with Christmas holly stuck on top. "Oh, what a wonderful pudding," Bob Cratchit said, and calmly, too, that he regarded it as the greatest success achieved by Mrs. Cratchit since their marriage. Mrs. Cratchit said that now the weight was off her mind, she would confess she had had her doubts about the quantity of the flour. Everybody had something to say about it, but nobody said or thought it was at all a small pudding for a large family. It would have been flat heresy to do so. Any Cratchit would have blushed at the hint of such a thing. At last the dinner was all done, the cloth was cleared, the hearth swept, and the fire made up. The compound in the jug being tasted and considered perfect, apples and oranges were put on the table, and a shovel full of chestnuts on the fire. Then all the Cratchit family drew round the hearth in what Bob Cratchit called a circle, kind of like the circles we do here at Montessori Academy, meaning half of one. At Bob Cratchit's elbow stood the family display of glass, 2 tumblers, and a custard cup without a handle. These held the hot stuff from the jug, however, as well as golden goblets would have done, and Bob served it out with beaming looks, while the chestnuts on the fire sputtered and crackled noisily. Then Bob proposed, "A Merry Christmas to all, my dear hearts. God bless us," which all the family re-echoed. "God bless us, everyone," said Tiny Tim, the last of all. He had sat close to his father's side upon his little stool. Bob held his withered little hand in his, as if he loved the child and wished him to be by his side, and dreaded that he might be taken from him. "Spirit," said Scrooge, with an interest he had never felt before, "tell me if Tiny Tim will live." "I see a vacant seat," replied the ghost, "in the poor chimney corner, and a crutch without an owner, carefully preserved. If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, the child will die." "No, no," said Scrooge. "Oh, no, kind spirit. Say he will be spared." "If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, none other of my race," returned the ghost, "will find him here." "What then? If he be like to die, he had better do it and decrease the surplus population." Scrooge hung his head to hear his own words quoted by the spirit, and was overcome with petulance and grief. "Man," said the ghost, "if man you be in heart, not adamant, forbear that wicked cant until you have discovered what the surplus is and where it is. Will you decide what men shall live, what men shall die? It may be that in the sight of heaven you are more worthless and less fit to live than millions like this poor man's child. O God, to hear the insect on that leaf pronouncing on the too much life among his hungry brothers in the dust." Scrooge bent before the ghost's rebuke, and trembling cast his eyes upon the ground. But he raised them speedily on hearing his own name. "Mr. Scrooge," said Bob, "I'll give you Mr. Scrooge, the founder of this feast." "The founder of this feast, indeed," cried Mrs. Cratchit, reddening. "I wished I had him here. I'd give him a piece of my mind to feast on. I hope he'd had a good appetite for it." "Oh, my dear," said Bob, "the children, it's Christmas Day." "It should be Christmas Day, I'm sure," said she, "on which one drinks the health of such an odious, stingy, hard, unfeeling man as Mr. Scrooge. You know he is, Robert. Nobody knows it better than you do, my poor fellow." "My dear," was Bob's mild answer, "Christmas Day." "I drink to his health for your sake and the day's," said Mrs. Cratchit. "Not for his. Long life to him, a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. He'll be very merry and very happy, I have no doubt." The children drank the toast after her. It was the first of their proceedings which had no heartiness in it at all. Tiny Tim drank it last of all, but he didn't care twopence for it. Scrooge was the ogre of the family. The mention of his name cast a dark shadow on the party, which was not dispelled for a full 5 minutes. After it passed away, they were 10 times merrier than before, and the mere relief of Scrooge, the baleful, being done with. Bob Cratchit had told them how he had a situation in his eye for Master Peter, which would bring in, if obtained, full 5 and 6 pence weekly. The two young Cratchits laughed tremendously at the idea of Peter being a man of business, and Peter himself looked thoughtfully at the fire from between his collars, as if he were deliberating what particular investments he should favor when it came to his receipt of that bewildering amount of income. Martha, who was a poor apprentice at a milliner's, then told them what kind of work she had to do and how many hours she worked at a stretch, and how she meant to lie abed tomorrow morning for a good long rest, tomorrow being a holiday she would pass at home. Also, how she had seen a countess and a lord some days before, and how the lord was much about as tall as Peter, at which Peter pulled up his collar so high that you couldn't have seen his head if you had been there. All this time the chestnuts in the jug went round and by they had a song about a lost child traveling in the snow from Tiny Tim, who had a plaintive little voice and sang it very well indeed. There was nothing of high marks in this. They were not a handsome family. They were not well dressed. Their shoes were far from being waterproof. Their clothes were scanty, and Peter might have known, and very likely did, the inside of the pawnbrokers. But they were happy, grateful, pleased with one another, and content with the time, when they faded and looked happier yet in the bright sprinklings of the Spirit's torch at parting. Scrooge had his eye upon them, and especially upon Tiny Tim to the last. And I'll end it there, and we'll continue tomorrow. This is Literature, MAB Elementary. Mr. T wishing you season's greetings.